1935, the Lions win the NFL championship. The Detroit Tigers take the World Series. The Red Wings bring home Lord Stanley's Cup. Joe Louis begins his rise to world domination. This transforms the Motor City into Detroit, City of Champions.
There you go with the crack of the bat. We are off and running Detroit City of Champions as we record live downtown Detroit. Talking about the Detroit City of Champions, we're at the Detroit Shipping Company. Glorious, glorious summer day and enjoying it. And Podcast Detroit Studios, Jamie Flanagan along with
Charles Avison.
And Charles
Charles Avison.
Charles wrote a trilogy of books, a screenplay, all about the magnificent, amazing, astounding 1935 year. And we've been talking about baseball, we've been talking about hockey, we've been talking about football. And now we're going to move into boxing. We need to set some groundwork. Matt Fox is along for the ride today.
You know, because of who we are talking about today,
and
I wanted to be a part of it from the very start. Because I would always come in mid-story, but I wanted to really understand this right here, this gentleman that you're going to be talking about.
Well, unfortunately, we're not talking too much about Joe.
Well, but there was it had to start somewhere.
The lead-in.
Because that's the thing. I wanted to get the.
But I appreciate that. Yeah,
I want to understand it from the very beginning and why he became who he is.
Well, that's what we're going to be diving into. Absolutely.
Yep. Yes.
And just get closer to the mic. These things pick up. There you go.
Yeah.
So we want to talk about the history of boxing. So, Charles, in your books, how deep do you go into the history of boxing? And is this the history of boxing in Detroit? This is my favorite interviewing technique, though. I ask two pretty unrelated questions to a guest at one time and see how they answer. I'm a crappy interviewer.
All
right, so here's my two questions.
I think you're a great interviewer, just for the record.
So, is this the history of Detroit? How far back are we going?
So similar to what we did with the Red Wings.
Yeah,
like with the Red Wings, we started out with the beginning with the birth of hockey.
Sure, and why the cup was important. It wasn't Detroit.
Exactly,
we hadn't even got to Detroit.
Exactly, but we talked about what we saw with the hockey how. The evolution of just the NHL. How Jack Adams was part of the NHL. How the history of the NHL. Yeah. There was no way to really tell the story of the Red Wings without talking about the birth of the NHL. Even though that stuff wasn't necessarily specifically Detroit.
Yeah.
I think we saw by the end of all the shows we did for the whole Red Wings segment. Just how it all tied in, especially when we were talking about the Ottawa Senators in 1926. Mm-hmm. That was basically unrelated to the Wings, and we would have never understood that team without laying the groundwork prior to that.
So that groundwork, squeaky voice, the groundwork that we did. Matt and I had just recorded a man cave.
We've been talking
hour.
to each other all day long. Man.
So I'm squeaky voice, but so we talked about the groundwork for hockey, and now we're going to lay the groundwork for boxing.
Yeah,
how much of that is in the trilogy of books, Detroit City of Champions?
So there's a signature. What we're talking about, it goes a little bit on the outside the boundaries of the books.
Okay,
but the main thing I want to get to today is a major component of the books.
Okay.
So this isn't entirely unrelated. I mean, it does.
So I didn't know. Because you got to that's the thing about media today, right? Because I teach high school journalism, right? And my kids and we always and journalism is changing. It's evolving, right? Because of this thing. Matt, I don't know if you heard about it. It's the internet.
Take it to the internet.
Hash browns.
Hashtag that.
Take me to but media has changed, right? Before you had column inches, and that's why the inverted pyramid style was what it was. You had the most important information first, and less and less and less. And if they had a cut, they would cut the less important information, right? And so that was like the inverted pyramid style that of journalism that and that model still holds true, very much so in a lot of journalistic writing. But I mean, with the interweb. You got all the space you need, right? Yeah. And now with news shows, TV news, Walter Cronkite, he only had 30, 60 minutes to tell their stories. Now you got 24-hour news channels, and they're dying to fill, right? So you can expand more. So in your books, you have limited column inches.
Same thing, absolutely.
You have limited column inches in your book. So I'm just curious how much of this you were able to fit into the book because it's already 3 freaking volumes.
Yeah,
it could have been.
Believe when I say,
Encyclopedia Britannica with 30 of them on your shelf.
Believe when I say that every single inch of that book, like there was so much stuff I had to cut out. You would not believe what I had to cut out.
And I'd like to
So every single inch of that book, of those 3 books, there is zero fluff. And now let me just say one thing. The main thing you mentioned, like the media concept, the pyramid or the inverse pyramid, whatever. The way that I learned, the biggest thing that I learned when I was in college, it was when I was studying in Edinburgh, Scotland. I had this professor this guy was like, man, this guy was so awesome. He was one of my favorite teachers because this guy was like 80 years old, and he was like, listen to me. He's like, I've been teaching for like 50 years.
Yeah.
Okay, he's like. He goes, I don't want to hear if you have anything to say in class or if you have anything in your papers that you write, every single thing better be relevant. I don't want to hear it. He goes, I don't have time for fluff. I don't want to hear anything that's not directly related to what we're talking about. And so to do that, he said, this is what I want you to do. He goes, this is what I've been doing for a long time, and this is what I want you to do, at least for this class. And I've done it ever since for everything I've done. Everything I've ever written has been used this model.
Margins.
So what he did was he said, ask the question, the purpose of why you're writing, okay? The question that you're asking and trying to resolve through your paper, through your work or whatever it is, the subject matter you're trying to cover. He said, write it down on a Post-it note or on on an index card and fold it in half, like a single sentence. And he said, leave that sitting in front of you for the entire duration of your project. He's like, if anything you're doing or writing or whatever does not directly go towards answering that question or that specific thing, it's fluff and it's not part of it.
Oh, wow.
And so he's like, it'll help. And so I've always done that. And so that's kind of like what, with regards to what we're talking about today, and with regards to the whole show. I don't like fluff. I don't.
No,
like
and it's a double-edged sword too. So before you were limited in print to column inches, right? And they would cut, and you would do the inverted pyramid style. Now the problem is there are so many news sources. There are so many podcasts that if you don't have somebody's attention, and because we've lost everybody so far, it's like, but if you haven't hooked people and they're not staying, they're not gonna stay.
Well, there's another thing too, and that's
you got to keep them. So no fluff.
That's another thing too that I learned. And actually, I learned this on my own, and it was and this was from when I was diving into the Detroit Times.
Yeah.
I really got into William Randolph Hearst, who was the biggest newspaper syndicate. He owned the biggest syndicate of newspapers. He was fascinating dude. Anyways, the top editor for all of his newspapers, his name is Arthur Brisbane, and he had a saying that he made every single one of his writers write on their desks. Like right on there, it says, if you have not captured the reader's attention by the very first sentence, then there's no need to write anymore.
Yeah.
He said that's what he said. That was like his signature line. So now I have that sitting next to my desk. That's a permanent fixture.
Yeah.
If you haven't captured the reader's attention from the very first sentence, then there's no reason to do it anymore. You know what I mean?
And as we're 8 minutes in and haven't done a bloody thing.
Well, I think so.
Let's talk about boxing. I'm kidding, man.
I think we've covered. I think we're talking. I think we got I think we got our listeners' attention.
I think we do. Yeah. All right. So where are we at? So where are we starting with? So we're delving into. We're going to get to Joe Louis, but before we do, we're going to set some groundwork. History of boxing. Where are we at? What are we doing?
Well, so there's this podcast I've been hooked on recently. It's just a history. It's called the Downfall of Civilization.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah.
So, anyways, this one of the things that's so great about this show, it's so cool, is this guy. He's talking about the Aztecs, right? I was listening to like this show about the Aztecs and the fall of the Aztec Empire, and he starts off. He goes, 6 million years ago, he goes, he's like, a lone pterodactyl is flying through sky. Like, you're sitting there like, he's talking about the Aztecs or whatever, and he goes 6 million years before he covers like the shift of the tectonic plates and how the geography of the Aztecs shifted and everything. So he starts way back.
So is that how boxing started?
So no, it's so kind of an homage to that. I want
pterodactyls.
I want to go back. Okay, yeah. No, it doesn't go back that far, but I want to take it back to one of my
Tyrannosauruses.
My favorite book ever. My favorite book ever. We're talking about the history of boxing, and just for the fun of it, I want to just at least mention. Just the idea that like my favorite book ever, my all-time favorite book is the Iliad by Homer, and in the Iliad they talk about there was a funeral for a guy named Patroclus. He was a hero, of a Mycenaean hero, Greek hero, and there was these funeral games for him in which there was a boxing matches. There was a boxing match, and they got trophies and prizes for winning that these contests. So I want to just start out with a video, kind of an homage to this fall of the civilization. How's it go? Boxing begins back to 3,000 years ago. With the Iliad of Homer and the Trojan War is up, but it actually goes back even a little bit further than that. But I just wanted to start back where it started. That's what boxing is. But it's actually kind of interesting because boxing is that old. Okay, it is that old. This
Men square off.
And if you think about it, if you think about it, just think like this: that boxing. This is a sport, like human being. Boxing is a sport that captures this element of humanity, which is fist versus fist.
Yes.
Cavemen were duking it out with one another as to who's going to drag the chick into the cave.
Exactly, but the conversion of it into an actual sport, into an actual athletic event. The fact that two guys are going to strap on leather and they're going to stand toe-to-toe in a group, in a circle of people, right, and win a prize for whoever comes out of it.
I love the old-timey.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that there's something visceral about boxing, and it's something that goes back. When we're talking about the history of boxing, one thing to go, boxing began back 2,000 years ago, whatever. But no, it's another thing to say that boxing began. That boxing is it's one of the most purest sports that you can possibly ever have. There's nothing. It's man versus man, woman versus woman, whatever. It's person versus person, and it goes back to the dawn of time. Whether as a warfare thing, or whether it's the fact that they converted it into an actual sport where they're looking at each other and everybody's gathered around them saying which one of these two dudes are going to win. Sure. And it's many versions. Whether they're wearing leather straps, whether they're wearing bare fists or whatever in a prize fighting situation. Yeah. The fact this is this is one of the oldest, purest sports known to mankind.
Yeah.
This is this is a sport that brings out that one of the components of human nature.
It's an animalistic sport.
Yes, but like I say, the purity of it. This is human beings. This is a component of our nature.
Here's the thing, though,
turned into a sport, and that's what's beautiful. That's why they call it's a beautiful science.
Well, that's the thing, and it's to digress slightly. Two things surprised me. One. Boxing. I think boxing was safe, but they were going to pull wrestling from the Olympics, and it's that's
another sport. The same thing. Wrestling goes back with boxing, and it's one of the oldest sports.
And it's how do you remove wrestling from the Olympics? It is the Olympics.
Yeah.
It is the thing. And today, boxing is facing a lot of challenges because of the popularity of the MMA, the mixed martial arts stuff, and so boxing. But boxing, there's not an air, I guess, an air of just a gentlemanly.
Exactly, and that's what I'll get to that in a second.
It's a sportsmanship. I don't see a lot of sportsmanship in MMA.
There is. It's a raw, visceral sport, just like boxing. As long as it's regular.
Not a gentlemanly sportsmanship.
Well,
I don't know.
You step into the ring.
It's more brutal, I think.
And your job.
It's more brutal. There's no doubt. But it's. Go ahead, man.
I say you step into the ring, and your job is to beat the snot out of this other person across the way from you. You go
snot.
18 rounds with this individual, and at the end of it, the bell rings. They hug it out.
Yeah, that's what makes it a sport,
right?
MMA too.
MMA is
exactly.
UFC, MMA. It's the same way, but it's still the sport itself and how it has become what it is today is because of a few individuals throughout history.
Boxing just seems a little more elegant than
there's a
MMA.
case to be made for that. Sure, there's a case to be made for it. But as far as but here's the thing is that in all the way back the regulations for boxing and for wrestling, there might be sports going all the way back to 2,000 years BC with the same hybrid components. So there's a case to be made that MMA is just as pure of a sport as anything. Sure. Yeah. As long as the combatants agree to the rules prior to the thing, you see, I think that's the main component. And that they,
tell that to the lion.
But there is, a certain gentlemanly component to the boxing thing. But the next thing you
No,
mentioned,
I know him. He's a friend from work. Loki, look who it is. Sorry.
Gotta get out of here.
So you mentioned
Gotta
the
get off
Olympic
this
Games.
planet.
So you mentioned
Sorry, we digress.
So you mentioned the Olympic Games,
Yes.
and I wanted to throw in there another little sort of ancient mention is that it was actually an Olympic sport beginning in 688 BC.
Oh, all right.
So the Olympic Games go all the way back,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
the boxing is one of these original
And
sports.
I can't believe they pull wrestling because wrestling is like, how
That's
do you
an
pull one of
original
the,
as well.
How do you
That's an
pull one of those
absolute original.
foundation
Well, the era that
blocks,
we
you know?
live in,
Oh,
man.
but we need ping pong.
No, the
Right.
era
You
that
know,
we live in, dude.
the Olympic ping pong, you know. Springsteen's daughter doing steeplechasing, in her on her
Forget
horse.
about the history and all
That's
this stuff that
important.
makes people, and
Yeah.
it makes humans, human beings. And the reality human beings, you start to pull it because it's not some idealized version. And here we go. You start heading down a path where you don't even know who the hell you are anymore.
Right.
So
this is
the modern boxing that brought us to Joe Louis. What do we need to know about the modern boxing?
Fast forward a lot.
Yeah.
So
From-
to the
from
next
600
point,
BC to
1867. Okay, which is a long, quick warp through time. You guys nailed it. You guys right on cue. Okay. So 1867 is when people may have heard it's called the Queensberry Rules, which is the full title is the Marquess of Queensberry Rules.
Oh, wow.
Is that
I like
is that a New York thing?
I want to
no,
put that.
it was English.
Is it
I want to
English?
put
Okay.
that on a T-shirt.
The Marquess of Queensberry Rules in 1867, when those were established, the idea was that before 1867, it was just a free for all. They just have random people fighting in a
kidding. I'm
barn to
putting
make
it on
money,
T-shirt.
right? but the Marquess of Queensberry Rules, what it did was it established there was 12 different components to it, and it was like a 24-foot ring.
Mm-hmm.
Both fighters had to have leather on their hands or some kind of padding on their hands. It was a regulated thing. There was both fighters had to be on their feet when they were fighting. You couldn't beat on somebody when they're on the ground.
Right.
Like all these different, the general principles of what we understand, what we see boxing as today.
Right.
Similar to when the New York Knickerbockers established baseball, where they laid down the ground rules of
Yeah.
baseball, and then the rules have since been massively modified. There's all these different disclaimers, but the overall framework remains the same. And so that was a big development. So and so after that, boxing. After that, you at least you could say, okay, we're fighting by the Marquess of Queensberry rules. You know what I mean? So you knew that was, and the more that they fought with those terms, the more that it became sort of a thing.
Right.
The more that it became like officially sanctioned. that kind of a thing. So I guess you could say a little bit of legitimacy came in with the Marquess of Queensberry rules. And so in the late 1880s. Fights were, one of the biggest things that boxing has been struggling for forever, even to this very day, is this legitimacy, the sense that it's not just like this dark room, back alley, gamblers, thing where it's fought in the dark. And so in the 1880s, that was certainly a major issue, which was the stigma of boxing is this the dregs of society fought in the back, and no civilized person would go watch a boxing match. But the reality is people like to watch people punch each other. So it doesn't matter what the high society says about it. There's probably half a high society down there in the back alleys watching them box.
Chomping on their cigars and tuning in.
Being part of the whole thing. So the late 1880s, that's when really it starts to develop, and it's just prize fights, a lot of different prize fights. But it was really a big an important era because in 1892 the first heavyweight championship under the Queensberry rules was a fight between two guys named Gentleman Jim Corbett and John L. Sullivan. It was in New Orleans. It was really everything's really a lot of it started. The Queensberry thing started off in England, and England was really a mecca for boxing. And then it drifted over to the United. Boxing was already huge in the United States too, but like the prize fighter and just two guys punching each other in the face for money. That's not exclusive to any particular region, but in this case, the Queensberry rules drifted over to America, and then so in this case, we have the first recorded heavyweight championship in 1892, and it was won by Gentleman Jim Corbett. And so that was like the first really the verified sort of heavyweight championship fight. And then leading into the early 1900s, the turn of the century, you have a guy one of the first really big name in boxing emerges, and his name is Tex Rickard. And Tex Rickard, they call him the PT. Like the only two other people that are in the same category as Tex Rickard are P.T. Barnum and Don King.
Wow. Okay.
So this guy is a promoter like par excellence. Like he is one of the elite promoters that has ever lived.
That's the greatest showman for
history.
you.
Exactly. Like Tex Rickard, we could do several shows on Tex Rickard. Tex Rickard's career, among his things he did was he established the New York Rangers in hockey.
Okay.
Was almost solely responsible for the third generation of the building of Madison Square Garden. He was just the elite of the elite as far as the sort of like the builders of boxing, the way that it eventually became. Tex Rickard was just one of the most signally important people, and of course the reason he did it was because there's a hell of a lot of money to be made in boxing.
Yeah.
As they found out. And so because you would have, the idea was you had these early stars. Some of these other early stars are Jim Jeffries and Bob Fitzsimmons. So like early champion, early stars and of boxing.
Were they still in the 1800s? Those two, or
in the turn of the century?
Okay.
Late 1800s, early 1900s. But the big thing is that one of the things that we recognize Tex Rickard doing is playing these easily like sort of cultural differences versus each other, like whatever he can to hype up a fight. Like this guy's the greatest Italian boxer of all time. This guy is the greatest Jewish boxer, whatever.
Right.
Kind of compartmentalizing them, and then giving people like something to fix their brain on, and saying, oh, okay, this is the greatest of this and the greatest of that, and then bringing in whatever stereotypes and judgments and whatever, have to kind of lumping it into that fighter. And then say whatever the stereotypes are. Go, well, that's this guy's smart.
That reminds me of the movie Far and Away.
Yeah. Oh, that's exactly. I love that movie. It's a great movie. Yeah, exactly. It's a very similar component where they're fighting for money. The guy's a janitor here and there, but he's just got a hell of a right. So he's fighting in a bar, and then he starts getting bigger, and he can fight other people. So that's the idea. Is that it's guys it's guys just punching each other in the face, and then building up a reputation for themselves, and then one town puts this guy against another town. It's kind of like baseball. How baseball and all these sports evolved, which was like, we got the best fighter in the entire Midwest. No, we do. Well, let's put them together and let's all go watch it, and then
Let's figure that out.
We'll figure it out, and I'll put a bunch of money to it, and the one guy's collecting money for both of them. There's a purse that they both divide,
right?
And that's how it really. It's how all professional sports evolve, is through competition. And so, and this is what's interesting. In 1902, a fighter named Joe Gans becomes the first black lightweight champion. And so, this is the first, in the world of boxing, the first, black man is recognized for. And I have a little slide of him on there. It's towards the end, or actually, it's the first slide. I gave you number one. And then so that was so we have it's the first black light heavyweight champ. So he's an early star of the game. Okay,
the 1900s there.
Yeah, the very first one.
There
in 1900s.
Yep.
So the first slide we have a few different photos of some of these guys, and so anyways, and then so in 1908, however. This is really the main guy that I focus on in the book, and main component was regards to Joe Louis, because it's an incredibly important component.
Okay.
1908, Jack Johnson becomes the first black heavyweight champ.
Huh.
Jack Johnson. And so have you guys heard this name before?
Yeah, Upside Down, Fireside.
What's that? No, he's the first black heavyweight. So you have so
Upside Down.
Okay, yeah.
Your turn. Sorry,
Not in that
different.
order.
No,
So
he's
Jack-
still
so-
making music today.
So Jack Johnson.
different Jack Johnson.
Jack Johnson. This is a guy that this is a guy that same as these white fighters. He's this guy that comes out of nowhere, comes out of Galveston, Texas.
Yeah.
And he's just he's fighting just to kind of earn a living. At first he's fighting because he kind of likes it. Then he's fighting and he's fighting because he fights a guy. And the guy, they both get thrown in jail together because they were fighting illegally on a dock somewhere. and then the guy in the jail, and it's a white guy. This guy in jail, the wardens tell them because the fine was like $5,000, which was out of control. That's a ridiculous amount in the early 1900s for them to get out of jail. Him and this white guy that he was fighting. And they were both they were both actually boxers. They were fighting for prize money. It wasn't just like they got into a random spat. These are both actual prize fighters. They're sort of low level prize fighters at this moment. And then the wardens of the jail cell said, "We will let you guys out of here on a dramatically discounted bail if you two fight inside your cell.
Oh my
Oh
god.
my god!
And so as well, we watch and take bets and make
And
money
said
off
the
of it.
birth of cage fighting.
Well,
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
and so,
first cage
anyways,
match.
and so
Yeah.
this is one of the. And so Jack Johnson fights this guy in this jail cell, and then the guy that he fights ends up becoming his trainer. He's like, dude, because the guy, he was like kind of like at the end of his career, and Jack Johnson was like really young, and so he said, he goes, you are way too good to be like, he goes, to get, like he was like, because Jack Johnson was super raw. He had nobody had ever trained him or anything. And so this guy was like, he was like, you're way too good to just, to ever, he's like, you're too fast and too athletic to ever take a punch. He's like, I just punched the hell out of you. And you've never, he's like, you're way too talented to ever take a punch.
Right.
And so we actually sort of, developed him into a prize fighter.
Wow, okay.
And so over the next couple of years, he just started getting more and more fights and getting more and better. And there's this interesting component to his story of how he became heavyweight champion, was that there's a guy named Tommy Burns. He was an Australian, and Tommy Burns was the heavyweight champion at that time. And so if there's a movie called, have you ever seen Rocky 3?
Which one was that?
Is the Rocky 3 it's got Mr. T in it.
Okay.
B.A.
Yeah,
Baracus.
yeah.
Or I say B.A. Baracus from the 18, but that's how I love the 18. That's my show. But no, Mr. T in Rocky 3.
Called me face in high school.
In Rocky 3, so in Rocky 3, Mr. T plays Clubber Lang. Okay, and Rocky is like this. He's won the championship, and he's like giving interviews. And he's kind of a superstar. And Clubber Lang's like just coming up, and he's hungry, and he wants a fight with Rocky. And so he's like showing up to all Rocky's press conferences and going like, "You're a loser. You're a loser. I'll beat the hell out of you." He's like, "You're a loser." And he's like starting fights at his press conference. Like, you ain't got the guts to challenge me. You ain't got the guts to challenge me. It's amazing. Mr. T plays an incredible role. It's Clubber Lang.
Antagonistic? Yes, please.
Massively, yeah. So he baits Rocky into giving him a shot at the championship, right at the belt. That's eerily reminiscent of what Jack Johnson did to get his shot at Tommy Burns.
Oh.
Was that he basically he was like, so he must have been gotten a little money from some prize fighting. He probably had a little bit of a backer that saw how good he was, because he was able to he basically chased Tommy Burns around the world. Insulting him at every single where he could, wherever there was a newspaper, where there was a photograph, insulting this guy and saying, you ain't nothing, I'm going to pound you, whatever like this. And so Jack Johnson at this point had won the black heavyweight championship. So he was he was like, I'm the black heavyweight champion, you're the white heavyweight champion, let's do this. Let's do something, let's make this happen.
Let's find the world
exactly.
champion.
And so eventually
Let's make it a world
Tommy
champion.
Burns gave him a fight, and so he actually let him have a fight, and under the condition he got like $30,000 out of the fight, which is a huge amount at the time.
Oh God, yeah.
And so and they fought, and Jack Johnson won. And so Jack Johnson becomes, so he's the black heavyweight champion. He takes the fight title from Tommy Burns, and now he's the official. In
that scenario, Clubber Lang won.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, as he did in the Rocky 3. Now, spoiler alert. That's what I'm saying. Like, or at least the initial fight. So, so Jack Johnson becomes a heavyweight champion in the world. Okay, and so, so he's the first black heavyweight champion. Just so we understand that concept. So a couple years later, and this is sort of an important component too, and this is on the file that I gave you to put up on the screen there.
Which one?
Where it's a Jack Johnson slide.
Oh,
it's
yeah, it's up.
Second. Yep. Okay. So in 1910 there's what's called the fight of the century.
Huh.
Okay. And
already?
Exactly. And so but this is Tex Rickard hype in this fight, the fight of the century, right? And so what this fight was between Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries. Jim Jeffries, as we mentioned a second ago, was one of these early stars, early early champions of boxing. And so there's a line. One of the first things you hear about, like, there's this quote by Jim Jeffries. I wrote it down because Jim Jeffries says, "I am going into this fight for the sole purpose of proving that a white man is better than a Negro."
Wow.
Okay, that's Jim Jeffries' quote. Now that that quote a long time has been said, like, a lot of times they've been first hearing that, you might be like, oh, Jim Jeffries is like a racist or whatever, especially to our modern ears. However, keep in mind, this is Tex Rickard promoting this fight. Yeah. Okay, and this is the concept. I think it's actually a good example. Especially, I'm going to read a quote of after the fight of what happened, of what Jim Jeffries said, and you can see that this is a component where they're hyping, they're trying to draw spectators. And so you've got this, this black man who's the current heavyweight champion. You've got Jim Jeffries, who's a former heavyweight champion.
Well, they got to pay these purses too.
Exactly.
They
want to draw as much money as they can. And so really, one of the things that they utilized was this black versus white.
Right.
Easy. I mean, it's an easy to understand concept.
That $30,000.
Well, that was for the Tommy Burns fight. This is a whole nother level. Now we're talking.
All right, but
that
$30,000 today. About 900,000.
Yeah, well,
so it's close to $1 million.
Type this into the equation there, which is in this case, this fight we're talking $100,000.
Holy crap!
Yes, So
they got to hype it because they got to make money.
Right. Exactly.
Jack Johnson.
So that's what I'm trying to
say. That's a lot of bags of peanuts.
Jack Johnson, his nickname,
the
Galveston Giant.
He's a monster, as we see in the
What year was that?
So what? The $100,000 in 1910.
1910. Okay.
The Galveston Giant.
Yeah, he's a monster. Yeah, he's a bee. He's a
big guy. Like
that's 100,000, 2.8 million.
Jeez.
There you go. So it was a big fight. It was a huge fight, and one of the reasons it became a big fight was because of this idea of splitting these two. Like Jim Jeffries wasn't necessarily. Especially, I'm going to read the quote to show you. Just to kind of give you an example of the after fight and the things that people were saying, so people can understand, to put it in its proper context. So, spoiler, not a spoiler because we're telling the story. Jack Johnson wins the fight.
Yeah.
Right, and so I'm gonna read the quote sort of after to kind of show you, to kind of show the concept of. So this is what Jim Jeffries said after the fight. I couldn't have hit him. He said like this because they were talking about like would you have been able to beat him in your prime, Jeffries, that sort of thing. So he says I could never have whipped Johnson at my best. Jeffries said I couldn't have hit him. No, I couldn't have reached him in 1,000 years.
Wow.
So all right, and then after that, this is a better quote. This quote is from John L. Sullivan, who was like, as we mentioned, one of these early champions, superstars of boxing. So he was there too, and he said, so this is what he said: the fight of the century is over, and a black man is the undisputed champion of the world. It was a poor fight as fights go, this less than 15-round affair between James Jeffries and Jack Johnson. Scarcely has there ever been a championship contest that was so one-sided. All of Jeffries' much-vaunted condition amounted to nothing. He wasn't in it from the first bell tap to the last. He said, in talking again, these words come from a previous era, right? So the Negro had few friends, but there was little demonstration against him. Spectators could not help but admire Johnson because he is the type of prize fighter that is admired by sportsmen. He played fairly at all times and fought fairly. What a crafty, powerful, cunning left hand Johnson has. He is one of the craftiest, cunningest boxers that has ever stepped into the ring. They both fought with me in New Orleans. They both fought closely all during the 15 rounds. It was just the sort of fight that Jeffries wanted. There was no running or ducking like Corbett did with me in New Orleans. Okay, so he goes on and on. But if you mention, but you see what I'm saying? He has utmost respect for Jack Johnson. He's not like this black guy sucks. And
yeah. I mean, but besides that, the first mention of his color, after that it was like just this boxer.
It was like an identifier.
Boxer.
It was just it wasn't like a slur that he was saying.
No.
He was just describing the fact that he's a black man.
Yeah, and it was like 1910, so that was like really polite for 1910.
Exactly. And I also want to add into this.
It was a gentlemanly sport.
It was a gentlemanly thing for 1910.
And that's what I'm saying is that at first glance, when you like anybody that sort of dives into the Jack Johnson story, especially the fight of the century, when you first see that quote by Jim Jeffries, like I'm going to fight this for the purpose of proving a white man is better than the Negro. When he says that, when he says your first thought is that this is a racist guy that's fighting this fight for this. But if you look at it into the context of it, the concept is that when they're promoting a fight in this era, and it's an easy promotion between a white man and a black man. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In that to ramp up the newspapers, that's what they gave them. Unfortunately, one of the sort of downsides, a major downside, was that the media a lot of these newspapers ended up continuing with this narrative, with the narrative of like now in essence Jack Johnson was massively demonized by the media. And the idea was that now it was a series of white boxers that all the newspapers were hyping up as the great white hope. As far as to dethrone this this black man. And but But here's the thing, though, is that, and this is one of the discussions we even have about Jack Johnson is Jack Johnson's behavior as the heavyweight champion of the world,
right?
Because at this time, as we're talking, he's the first black man to win. Black people weren't allowed in baseball. There's this is a heavily segregated area. Jack Johnson's own parents were slaves. He was a first generation freeman. So so this is talking about segregated eras and tough times in American history. This is it.
Yeah.
And so Jack Johnson would be like, when you actually look at his so. And I will. There's something I overlooked.
So Matt and I are making silly jokes about the campfire singer Jack Johnson.
Right.
Now I feel like a jerk.
But here's
I am a jerk.
It's I know, but this is an important component of understanding what we're about to talk about.
He's 6'5", right? His reach 6 feet 2 inches.
Yeah, and in 1910,
no wonder he couldn't. The other guy couldn't hit him.
In 1910, everybody else was like,
and he was a defensive style boxer too. Yeah. Well, no, you can see some of these big. These guys were some big fellas.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy that ended up beating him was a monster. Jess Willard was a beast. So, but anyways, and just to stop for a quick second, I do want to mention that the night of that fight, however, you can see how polarized the country was over the results of this fight, because there were riots in 25 states in 50 different cities. At least 20 people were killed and hundreds more were injured.
Wow.
As a result of this fight. Jeez. All right, and so on one side, you can look at it, and say, there's the potential element of it saying, well, we're hyping this fight up to be to drive to sort of a racial narrative between the two fighters. But on the other side of it, you can see what that kind of rhetoric, if it was. I'm not trying to say I haven't done super so deep into it that I can say definitively that it was seriously just to sell tickets. However, what we're talking about here is the type of rhetoric that's used to promote things or to try to make money off something or whatever. It's a dangerous thing to use. It's a dangerous thing to try to utilize for selfish means or selfish agendas. Because in this case, the results were, the media having hyped up some of the language that these boxers are using, these people are saying, it leads to riots and people getting killed and people, getting mangled. So anyways, and so not only did it didn't end there, because Jack Johnson, the type of person he was he's more akin to a modern day athlete than he was to a turn of the century athlete. He was super flashy. He drove super, flashy cars
because he could.
He could.
The picture that's up, the Jack Johnson, there's a trilogy of pictures. He's in a car and he's boxing, and then he's just standing there with his arms folded. He's standing there with his arms folded. He looks like a contemporary athlete. Yeah. So sometimes when you look at historical athletes, they look different. He looks like a contemporary athlete.
He's a monster. These photos that I try to use for some of these guys was to show them like that, because some of these, I always disagree with a lot of the photos they use, especially the 30s. They use a lot of these photos where they show them in these they're really bad camera angles. Yeah. They show them in some of these pictures. If you look at a lot of pictures of Jack Johnson, he's got these little kind of skinny little legs, and he doesn't look these super well proportioned. But there's so many great photos of him that show him when you're watching him
he's
on a video.
Monster here.
When you're watching him in a video, what's cool is that there's 6 of his fights that were recorded on film.
Nice.
This 1910 fight, this fight of the century, was recorded. Oh. It's in the Smithsonian as one of the most important movies ever made.
Nice.
And but anyways, when you're watching that fight, you're seeing Jack Johnson's a monster in this fight. He's just a big guy, and the guy he's fighting, Jim Jeffries, is a stud too. He's a beast. Mm-hmm. They're not but when you see a lot of the modern day photos in these books, I don't know who chooses a lot of these photos, because they make them look like these little runts that are super skinny, and they're your guys are making fun of, where they've got their fists up in the air like this. Because in the reality was, these guys, when they're punching, they're not going each other with little knuckles. These guys are when you watch the video, they're not throwing little knuckles and stuff. They're throwing haymakers, right? They're socking each other in the face. That's what I'm saying. That's why I've always...
lot less...
Exactly, with a lot less padding.
Right,
These guys are big guys. They're fighting 30 rounds, and they're beating the heck out of each other, dude. That's what I mean. Like, so that's why I chose a couple of the photos that show some of what I view them as, which is, I mean, reality photos, but where they're these muscular, tough dudes. Some of these guys got curly mustaches.
That's a great,
chest.
great photo.
See, they just stand there hitting each other.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So, anyways, and so, but one of the things, Jack Johnson can be more akin to a modern day athlete, where a lot of these guys, they're flashy, they're they have this flashy lifestyle. They're inside and outside the ring. Jack Johnson is taunting his opponents, which is totally like at the time like ungentlemanly sort of thing. And there's a lot of he married 3 different white women.
Oh.
And everything he did seemed to escalate and inflame the media against him more and more.
And in 1910,
so he was hated.
in the early 1900s,
yes,
he the African American man,
yes,
former slave,
yes, and he was
married
hated.
a white woman.
He was hated. He was detested. They hated.
Oh my God!
The media hated him.
That's
because of the things, and it's almost like it was like, I mean, they're
amazing.
The more the media hated him. The more stuff that he did, the more stuff he did.
Just applaud him for
So anyways,
you hate to call it bravery, but it's like,
here's the thing.
Yeah,
is that
it's awesome. It's awesome.
Well, so here's the thing. There's one side of it. There's again, I'm not taking any. All I'm talking about. I'm not going to take any side as whether a person has a right to be themselves and do whatever the heck they want to do. It's a free country. Yeah. And there's there's the other side that says you shouldn't do that. You should do what everybody needs you to do. As the first like black champion of anything in the country. But there's no doubt as to the impact of him having done it. I'm just telling you the history of it.
Right.
I'm not trying to take a side.
Because we're setting the stage.
As an American, I think that anybody should be allowed to do whatever they want. I actually side with Jack Johnson, saying do whatever you want to do. Yeah. I side with that side of it. I believe in individual freedom. That's where I am.
This is interesting how this is setting the stage for the rise of Joe Louis.
Exactly. That's why it's a very important thing. That's why I want to spend an entire episode talking about this. Right. So, but I do want to read to you. This is Booker T. Washington, okay? This is a quote from Booker T. Washington describing, when this was all said, and when Jack Johnson's career sort of was, all said and done, the impact of what he said. So this is Booker T. Washington. Said, "It is unfortunate that a man with money should use it in a way to injure his own people. In the eyes of those who are seeking to uplift his race and improve its conditions. I wish to say emphatically that Jack Johnson's actions did not meet my personal approval, and I am sure that they do not meet the approval of the colored race."
Wow. Okay. Wow.
So it was
interesting.
Not. So this is there's a great, if anybody that's interested in a further story of Jack Johnson, a good video of it is a Ken Burns documentary that's solely focused on Jack Johnson. It's called Unforgivable Blackness. Okay. It's a great documentary.
Do you think
there's other things? I don't want to say that it's a definitive story of Jack Johnson. So, there's many other things you can look into. It's just a nice little overall summary of his career.
To me, what it sounds like Booker T was saying, "Hey Jack, pump the brakes. Let's do this in baby steps."
Exactly.
And Jack
what he was
like,
saying.
Jack was like, "Nope." I'm going full bore. I'm going all the way. I'm going all the way, all the way, all the way.
You got to learn to run before you can crawl.
Jack's like, "Nope, I'm sprinting."
That was the result. The result was because, like, again, the debate is, and I am on the side of personal freedom.
Sure.
I believe a person should be free to say and do whatever the heck they want to do. This is America. However, there's no debate as far as the impacts of him having done whatever he wanted to do, and in essence, scandalized the mainstream press at this time, and created a situation in which the mentality of the mainstream media was this: no black man will ever get a chance to do this to us again.
Yeah,
we will never let another black man get a chance to do this.
I think Joe's got another idea.
Joe was true, but then this is what we'll get to. Okay, so so anyways, and one last one last little point about Jack Johnson. In 1913, he was convicted of violating the Mann Act, which was the Mann Act was transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes.
Right.
So they took away his man card.
Because he was married.
They convicted him of it. No, he transported a white woman across the border. I think it might have even it was a girlfriend of his.
Right.
And so he skipped bail after being convicted and fled the U.S. for 7 years. Jeez. And so eventually, a couple years later, in 1915, he would fight in Cuba against Jess Willard and lose his title in Cuba. And then Jess Willard would win, and he would stop being heavyweight champion. So anyways, so his career would last. He would still fight for many years, thereafter, but he would never be the heavyweight champion again. No, and because of that moment, because of that, it's like I say, I want to emphasize this. I'm all about personal freedom. A person should have the right to do whatever they want to do, but there is absolutely no debate about the impact of him having done so and behaving the way he, acting the way he did,
Sure.
because after that, no black man would get a chance at the belt again. And so, whereas where in this case, where he had gotten a chance to become black heavyweight, in this case, boxing became the color line. Color line was drawn in baseball. Color line is drawn, football, the NFL. And the color line now in boxing is not only just drawn, it's carved in stone.
Oh,
and so this is saying this is why it's important to understand. As the 1930s are going to unfold, this is what Joe Louis has to overcome.
right. Oh,
Joe Louis has to overcome not just the regular,
Everyday
segregation,
gross
the regular
prejudice.
everyday gross prejudice, the regular everyday
The additional
racism.
stigma that's out there.
Exactly.
At that time,
He has to exercise the ghost of Jack Johnson. So it's an additional burden, an additional hurdle that he must now overcome.
Because Jack was full bore. Jack sounds like
Exactly.
Jack was just like
Exactly. Totally.
110%.
And so that's what I'm trying to
doing
say.
it.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like that's why when we're going into Joe
I
Louis.
love Jack Johnson.
Well, exactly. There's a lot. There's a lot to like the guy. He's a fascinating character. And
I gotta check out that Burns thing.
It's
on
like
him.
exactly.
He probably does a good job.
It's amazing. He comes from a certain perspective.
Sure.
There's other perspectives to watch, but it's an excellent documentary as far as seeing like his early career and how he rolls and stuff like this. It's a great. He's got a lot of Ken Burns is Ken Burns. He's got a lot of great information. It's not the only perspective, though. Again, it's not the only perspective on this because there's elements of the Jack Johnson story, which it's been a while since I've seen the Ken Burns documentary, so I don't remember if this is parts included. But Jack Johnson, I was reading about it today, they were talking about how Jack Johnson, when he was a kid, when we think of like especially in this day and age, we're talking about racism and racial issues.
Yeah.
Jack Johnson had a quote from his own words where he talked about growing up in Galveston, Texas, and your first thought is like, well, he's a son of freed slaves, and there's he probably was like an isolated in the community or whatever it is, like your traditional American racism.
Yeah.
But in Jack Johnson's own words, he said he grew up with a bunch of white kids. And he loved them all. They were like, in his own words, he's like, I got along with everybody in town. We were all poor, we were all in the same thing. He's like, I used to go over to my white buddy's house and we would have food together. He's like he actually said when I was a kid, racism wasn't for me. It wasn't a thing. He actually said that, and that's out of his own words. And so and then of course the guy who really developed him as a boxer was another white guy. You see what I'm saying? Like from jail. So like when he was in jail, this is the guy that he's fighting in jail and stuff. So that's what I'm trying to say is that, and I forget if Ken Burns' documentary has that component in it. But what I'm trying to say is that there's, when it comes to history, and this is what I learned from the very beginning, you got to weigh it multiple sources. You can't just look at just one. Though Ken Burns is fantastic, and again, I can't remember off the top of my head if that has that component in it. But it wasn't, from what I've it is a good story. It's worth watching that. But the long story, what I'm trying to get at with this entire story is to show that to lead up to like this is what Joe Louis has to go up against.
Right.
Mm-hmm. This is what it is.
Is this a good spot to take a break till next time? Or?
Yeah, we can start off with the last chunk I was going to give. I think this is a great spot to leave off at because the rest we can use to start off the next show. Because I was going to talk about boxing in the 20s and 30s. I think it's a good play because I can warp speed ahead for we can introduce the show next week with that.
We can, yeah.
But this is the main thing I wanted to get to with this episode.
I want to leave with Jack. I got a crush on this guy now.
No, again, absolutely. And what's really cool about Jack Johnson is there's actually fight footage from like 6 different fights.
And that's
because they were such big deals at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's actual footage on Jack Johnson's fights, and you can actually watch him like 1910.
Wow.
You know, they're using camera, like you're looking at like World War I is one of my favorite subjects, and you're watching World War I footage, and the guys are zipping around like you can't. You know, it's all out of like the timing is off for the camera reels or whatever. It almost doesn't look real. But the Jack Johnson fights, they spent a lot of time making sure the cameras were just right and just perfect because they're. I read a little bit about it before I came in today. Was these movies after they filmed them? You know, they would put them in these like dime stores where people could watch the clips around the country, and they were the biggest selling things of the era.
Wow!
I mean, when there was a fight in Reno, Nevada against that we just talked about here, the fight of the century. Yeah. That's all over the country. People are that's one of the top grossing films of for the next 5 years.
It was the fight of the century in 1910. What?
1910. Yeah.
1910. It was already the fight of the century.
What's funny is if you look up fight of the century, there's like 6 other fights of the century. Yeah. Because they bill them as the fight of the. No, that one was good, but this is really
this is for the next century.
This is really the fight of the century. The other one was good, but this one's even better than that. Like this is the real one.
All right, so looking forward to it. I want to get Joe Lewis's son in here. I want to talk to him in the worst way. I want to get him here in the city.
I want to get Tom, and when we get to the go to the new studio and that, Tom's going to.
We'll at least get him on. We'll at least get him on the on the line. But
we're going to start getting into Joe Lewis in the next episode. Okay. I'm really itching to get.
I'll reach out to Joe Jr.
Well, whenever we're going to be talking about Joe for some weeks. We're going to have. There's plenty of weeks to get. It's not a big rush.
When we do that, it'll just be a.
We can even do it as a wrap.
It'll just be a love fest with Joe Jr. It really is.
We could even do it as a wrap. We could even do it as a wrap after we're done talking about Joe. We can bring him in to talk about and just some of the stuff that we, because we're going to tell the story of the 1935. Maybe he can fill in some of the gaps.
So Detroit City of Champions, the 1935 year. It's the most untold important story in Detroit.
It's one of the greatest stories ever told. We
history.
had an entire podcast show built on one season in Detroit sports history.
I was just talking to somebody
What other
here
show?
At the Detroit Shipping Company. There was a guy, the brothers, the owner.
Yep.
The brother.
Yep.
And we're talking about it, and I'm like, getting ready to record the show. Sports thing, 1935 in Detroit. He's like, what about 1935 in Detroit? And this guy is a music promoter, and he's like, he helped launch like some of the cooler underground, like Motor and like, cool techno stuff that happened in the city. Had no idea. And I'm telling him this. He's like, "What?
Nobody, man. Very few people do."
I know, and that's like it's and every week, and then you tell me something new, like Jack Johnson. I'm like, "What? Seriously? That's 1930. That's not 1935."
Jack Johnson is going to play a major role in the story, and not just because of the ghost that he's got to exercise. Jack Johnson is 1935. Jack Johnson's like 40 years old, 45, 50 years old.
Right he is quite in his prime, but he can still hold his own.
He's not going to box against Lewis. But what I'm saying though is that he is going to be a person that's like. Joe's trying to go become, do what he's trying to do, and Jack Johnson's gonna be like, "Hey, I'm the former heavyweight champion. I should coach you.
Yeah.
I should teach you."
Oh wow, I cannot wait to get
the
into
last
that.
thing that they want is Jack. They're trying to exercise the ghost of Jack Johnson. The last thing they want is Jack Johnson around.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like that's why it's so important to understand who Jack Johnson. But I'm saying like that's why it's so important to understand who Jack. The story of Jack Johnson a little bit in the earlier era to understand. To lead into what to what Joe had to overcome.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Oh, this is a fascinating story. This is I've said it before.
More coming, man.
Yeah, what I've said before. For the entire City of Champions story, Joe Lewis emerged as my favorite athlete. Garwood was my favorite story. And Mickey Cochran was my favorite Tiger. We got all the other players, but Joe Lewis, he's my favorite 35 Red Wing, and then Abby's my favorite overall 35 Red Wing. Yeah,
all right,
yeah, and Glenn Presnell is my favorite Lion. I'm not going to change that fact, So but that's what I mean. Like, but Joe Lewis before, and I want to say this too, real quick, because as a sort of final thing about the leading into the next week.
Mm-hmm. Final thought.
When I first started this project. I started it because I saw in a footnote at the bottom of a Detroit Tiger media guide that the Tigers, Lions, and Red Wings had won their all it said was their championships. It didn't say their first. But that was the only thing that I saw that kind of, it was like, oh, that's weird. I never heard of that before. I'm going to start looking into it. And so when I started, I knew nothing about Joe Lewis before this. I knew nothing about him. I knew that there was an arena named after him. I knew that he was a good boxer, great boxer, whatever, but I knew nothing about him. And it really wasn't until I started writing the book. Like, even when I wrote the thesis, like, I was like, he was part of it, but he didn't win the championship. I don't want to give it away, but in 35, he wasn't even the heavyweight champion. And so, like, I was like, well, he wasn't one of the main core group. And so it really wasn't even until I started working on the book that when I really started to sink my teeth into the story, and I started reading every single article and all this different stuff, when I realized just how important he was and how what he did in 1935. But the second book I wrote, the arc that I wrote, the entire, because the first one I kind of did a little mini story of Joe Louis. The second book I wrote, I was trying to figure out, because I'm like, I'd already told the story of Joe Louis in the first book, like regarding his 1935 season. I already sort of told the story about it. I'm like, well, what am I? I need an arc. I can't just do the same thing I did in the first book for Joe. And so that's when it dawned on me. Something. There's a whole kind of backstory behind it, but something kind of dawned on me. I'm like, this is the greatest individual season in the history of American sport, and I am going to prove it in the second book. In this book, I'm going to prove that this is that what Joe Louis did in 1935 was the greatest individual season in the history of American sport. And that's a bulk. There's been a heck of a lot of great seasons in all these different sports. And the fact that in 1935, Joe Louis didn't even win his championship in 1935. So he's starting already. When I'm talking about the book, and I'm saying it right now, I'm saying I spent the entire chapter of Joe Louis making the case that 1935 Joe Louis was the greatest individual season in American sport history by any athlete in the history of American sport, the greatest individual season. All right, and it was done by a guy,
didn't even win the championship.
And he didn't even win his championship. And that's what I'm saying. I'm starting with a handicap. All right, because you're starting with a handicap, saying there, like in every other case,
with a caveat.
At the very least, they won their championship. Right. In this case, what I'm saying is I'm starting with a handicap, and I believe that I made the case effectively in the book. And that is going to be the goal of this entire segment of the Joe Louis section. Okay, we're not just going to tell this story. I'm going to lay out a case as we tell this story that what Joe Louis did in 1935, regardless of the fact that he didn't win his championship in 35, that 1935 Joe Louis was the greatest individual season in American sport history. And like I said, that's the goal, and that's what I did in the book. That's what I'm going to make now.
Awesome.
And so we'll see how we'll see how that unfolds. But I think we're gonna do it. I think we're gonna do it, fellas.
Right.
What do you think? What are our odds? What are our chances?
Yeah, what do we get the book on that?
What do you think, Jamie? Give us an odds.
100%.
There you go, Matt. What do you think? Think we're gonna do it?
I'll be back on the next episode.
Absolutely. I hope the listeners are back in the next episode, because you got to follow along this one, folks.
That's it.
We can't go back and forth. This is a serious case. This is a serious subject here. You're talking about the greatest individual season. There's a lot of great individual seasons. How can this one man? And that's what, like I say, that's I chose that as the arc for that second section for Joe Louis, because that's the more that I read about him and what he did, the more I was just like, this is unbelievable of what this guy overcome, and in setting the stage for this episode, where showing what he had to overcome. As far as step number one is not just your regular old racism and separate, not just your basic color line, not just your standard, Jackie Robinson had to go against your standard color line in baseball, which is your regular thing. It was like die hard, dead set mentality, saying no black man will ever do this to us again.
Right.
That's what he had to overcome.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to dive more into it as we keep going. Please follow, subscribe. What is it? Collect
on the Pandoras.
Yeah, yes. That's it. Wherever you find us, we appreciate you. And wearingfunny.com, DetroitCityOfChampions.com, on the socials, on the Facebooks. And till next time, put them up.
There you go.